Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. And we're here to talk about the happiness science. Another day, another topic. Today, we're going to talk about how a scarcity of kindness affects happiness. And our wonderful guest, Hayley Blunden, is here in our virtual studio to talk about today's topic with us. Hayley is an assistant professor of management at the Kogod School of Business at American University. Her research focuses on how leaders can make challenging workplace interactions more productive. In her research spanning the domains of advice, feedback, voice, and virtual work, she seeks to improve the outcomes of workplace interactions by examining them as situated relational processes. Her research has been published in Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, Journal of Experimental Psychology, General and Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, and has been featured by Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, The Economist, CNBC, and Forbes. She earns a BA in Economics and Media Studies from the University of Virginia, an MBA from Columbia Business School, and a Ph.D. from Harvard University. Welcome to the show, Hayley.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, well, you have a very impressive background, and it's very fun. I think it's going to be great to talk about today's topic. But I think for you, it kind of has this lens where it's a lot of business research, as far as I can see. And I think everything can be applied in real life too, especially because we navigate all sorts of different relationships, including the ones at work, and I think that's a very big deal for a lot of people, because I know from talking to friends that, a big stressor in their lives is how to navigate all these things in the workplace, not just in, everyday life. Because I think in everyday life, it's probably a little bit easier. Work can be very stressful sometimes. So I'm excited to talk to you about the topic. But I'm curious, it's not like a thing you wake up and you're like, you know what, I want to research how leaders can make challenging workplace interactions more productive. I'm sure there's a story there. So why did you choose to do this, and how did you get here?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. I did not initially wake up and say, this is what I'm going to do with my life. It was a journey in terms of, I didn't start in academia. I started out working in consulting and internal strategy. And through those experiences, really saw that the heart of organizations and what makes them tick, what makes them successful or, more challenging to work in are these human connections, right? So the interactions, the daily interactions you're having with your colleagues. Is it easy to ask for advice? Is it easy to, navigate that social landscape that you need to navigate to be successful? And that really inspired me to go back and get my MBA. And I was going to go get my MBA and return to the workplace, not in strategy or finance, but in human capital. And I was going to be in practice and work on making those connections stronger, really fostering people's development. But along the way, I encountered Professor Catherine Phillips, the late Catherine Phillips, unfortunately, big loss for the world, really. And she exposed me to the field of management research. And this was a field that was really getting at the heart of these questions. How do we make those strong workplace connections? Why do they matter? She was really a pioneer in diversity research as well, and showing a lot of the benefits of what we gain when we have a diverse workplace. And as she was my professor in my MBA program, and I asked her, is this something that people at this point in their career can really do. And she was absolutely extremely encouraging, is absolutely the reason I am here today. And that kind of changed my path. And so then I went on, did my PhD and really studied these questions. How can we get these connections to be stronger? How can we foster the exchange of positive, useful, developmental information like feedback and advice? And that's what really brought me here.
Oh, beautiful. I love hearing stories of, people getting inspired, their professors, teachers, educators. It's just great to have, such great guidance in life. And I think that's also part of kindness, right? Because a lot of professors are there to kind of do their job, but I think there are people that are just going above and beyond, and they're just so kind to their students and really want their students to succeed and see lives a bit differently. And I think that's what happened there. And I'm glad to hear that it's led you here and we get to talk to you today about the topic. And as I said, the conversation is broadly about life, but I'm sure, from your research and from your work, you can see it. It's like a very big part of life, work. And then people at work, they bring all sorts of stuff from life into their work too. It's kind of like this really fun space to navigate, because sometimes I think at work, we just forget that we're all humans. We're here to work, but we're also living. And I think that's kind of like the fun bit about all this interaction in the workplace. And kindness is kind of something that is not always there. So we'll talk about that in a sec. I'm very excited to talk about it. Now, before we get to that part, we've got a section called Have You Met Hayley? Now we'll get to, we're going to get you to share a few things that you love with us so we get to know you better. First thing first, what is your favorite book?
Yes, so I really love history and I love historical nonfiction. So my favorite book is this book by Erik Larson, who really is a phenomenal author in this genre, very popular author. Most people are likely exposed to Erik Larson, but my favorite book of his is this book, Thunderstruck, which both at the same time details in great detail the development of the telegraph machine, which has a fascinating history that I was not aware of until reading this book, as well as it kind of pairs it with the history of this very famous murder in the UK. So a little bit darker than what I'm typically talking about and dealing with. But the way that he navigates that and ties those two stories together and really puts it in the global context of science, and it was a time when there was a lot of mysticism, is just so interesting to read. And I came out of, feeling like I knew a little bit more about the world and our past.
Oh, that is very cool. Well, thank you for sharing. I've never heard of that book before. So I'm going to have to investigate that further, after this. What about a movie you've enjoyed recently?
Yes. So I historically have not done a lot of cooking. And this is something that was one of my resolutions that I want to start getting a little bit better at doing this. And recently with my kids watched Ratatouille. So when he smells the cheese, like the expression on his face, it really inspired me to want to, try to get to the root of that and start cooking with really high quality ingredients. So that's been fun.
Beautiful. I mean, I don't know what it is about today, but I've been having a lot of cheese, and then we would say cheese at the beginning, and then now you mentioned cheese when cooking. I know it's not related to the movie per se, but it's just a funny observation of mine. This might be a cheesy conversation. Who knows? We'll see. Anyway, now you're our podcast guest today, and a lot of our podcast guests actually don't listen to podcasts. I wonder if you do. If you do, which one is your favorite show?
Yes, so I do listen to podcasts, often, honestly, in the car, which maybe is typical for people. But I also, I've recently started listening to podcasts when I'm tidying up the kitchen, because now I'm cooking and it's messy, right?
Yeah.
So I want something to do while I'm doing that. So in line with my really deep interest in this narrated, detailed history, there is this fabulous podcast, which is also probably relatively popular, so people will likely have been exposed to this, called The Rest is History. and it's by Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, and they are historians, but they go beyond their own expertise and really detail a lot of many, they have hundreds of episodes. So that's one. And then there's another one that I've enjoyed, which is The Inside Job, which is a workplace context, back to my research podcast. And it is actually narrated by Nyla Bari and Eric Johnson. And I know Dr. Bari she was the dean of students at Columbia Business School when I was there. So and she was just a force within that program. She had such a tremendous impact on each and every one of us, really, that it's listening to her talk through work feels like she just continued on that journey with us post MBA.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And my next question is about your role model. And, I remember you talking about your professor quite extensively at the beginning of our conversation. I wonder if she's your role model?
Yeah, so absolutely. Dr. Catherine Phillips it's just phenomenal role model. Another professor whom I greatly admire is Dr. Teresa Immobile. And she was really a pioneer in creativity research and introduced new methods of thinking about creativity at a time when I think when you're introducing something new in academia, it can be challenging. And she just is has the most delightful strength about her that often when I am trying to forge a new path, I think about her and she really inspires me.
Oh, that's so great to hear. Well, thank you for sharing about two of your role models, and they both sound like wonderful humans. And finally, in this part, I know you have done so many, degrees and taken so many courses to get here. I wonder which one would be the most influential to you.
It's going to be hard to trod past my first management class with, again, Dr. Kathy Phillips it's so influential, changed my life, right? Changed the course of my life. So that would certainly be one. Another course that I found really moving was Professor Hitendra Wadhwa taught a course on personal leadership. And what that was about was looking not externally, how do we lead and succeed as leaders, but internally, how do we do that? And looked at leaders across history and how they navigated these challenges and how in our own lives we can navigate them. So that's been really meaningful as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's really in alignment with your career and also a little bit with today's topic. So, let's talk about today's topic. We had to talk about how a scarcity of kindness affects happiness. And of course, the show is about happiness, and everyone has their own way of viewing happiness. And so my question obviously would be, Hayley, how do you view happiness?
Yes, it's such an important question. And as an academic, I think I have to go to the literature, right? That's where we go. And we see so there's two things, right? There's how is this being conceptualized? And then how is it being measured? So let's start with the first one. So what is happiness, right? There's actually several perspectives. You probably have, I'm probably not treading new ground here given the focus of this podcast, right? But there's this hedonic perspective, right? So attaining pleasure and avoiding pain, right? So, not just physical, right? So emotional, pleasure, etc. And then there's this eudaimonic perspective, right? And that's about satisfaction, doing something meaningful and like a little bit broader. And so I think that I think I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, that happiness, I think it's a broad term with a broad umbrella, and I would consider both happiness. But what we really do, as academics is I'll read a paper, it'll be a headline, doing this increases happiness, right? What do I want to know? Well, how are they measuring that, right? That's the key thing, because I want to know, okay, what's the thing that it's leading to? Is it so there's, of course, self-report scales of happiness, and there's some types of constructs where I don't know if a self-report scale is the best way to measure it, but happiness is one of them. I kind of if you're saying you're feeling happy, I'm kind of buying that because I think it's defined internally, right? So
Yeah.
I don't quibble too much with that. So that's kind of part of it. But then separately, right, there are other measures that are looking a little bit broader. So some will look at even things like economic welfare and categorize that as happiness. So I think regardless of how you define it internally or how I'm defining it, right, the key thing for me is understanding how whatever they're looking at, right, whatever a study is influencing, what that actual outcome is.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe there's my non-satisfying.
No, it's
everything, and it's
yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting in the sense that, each person has their own way of, let's say, look at a concept. Some might do research like yourself because, you've got an academic background, and some might just think about it in very simple terms, like what you were saying earlier. If you say that you're happy, I buy it, right? So it's kind of like, they probably don't define it based on research, but they feel it for themselves. And I think that's why happiness is such an interesting concept, because you can measure it. And at the same time, you kind of don't need to measure it because, you know it when you have it. And then at the same time, we're trying to understand it in depth so that we can work on it. And as a lot of our guests say, it's a constant journey. It's never going to be, there's no end to it. And it fluctuates. And that's why all this research is so important, because then we'll understand why it fluctuates and how. And I'm sure when you dig around the research, you probably will see, and especially when it comes to your background, I think you probably will see a lot of different research and data from people who probably have some misconceptions about happiness, or, things that they thought would bring them happiness, but in fact don't. So what would some of those be?
So the classic one, right? The classic one is money can buy happiness, right? Yeah. So that's a very classic misconception, but it's nuanced, right? So in some cases, maybe the money can't buy happiness is almost overemphasized, in that below a certain level of financial stability, it can, right? Yeah. So there's a threshold there, and so I think that there's misconceptions on both sides of that. Right. Yeah. Where both we think, well, money can't buy happiness. But actually, in some cases it can. But I think, it's interesting because it's very contextual, right? It depends on where you are, depends on cultural aspects really define your happiness, and your situation, your context determines what level at which you are attaining this financial stability, above which additional economic well-being doesn't necessarily correlate as well with happiness. So I think that's one of them, and it's interesting, and it's very nuanced. And then another is I think that there can be a perception out there that there's not that much that we can do to influence our own happiness. So of course, being deep in research about how to do just that, I'm not always encountering this, but out on the street, you hear this, that's just a not happy person. That's just, fill in the blank, that he's just not a happy person, or she's just not a happy person. And I certainly there are, of course, state and trade variables, and we can change some and we can't change others, but there is a lot that we can do to influence our own happiness, right? So things like spending money on experiences instead of material goods, things like having more social connection, things like how we frame our interactions are all really meaningful in terms of influencing our own happiness. So I think that's a second misconception.
Yeah, definitely. I really love what you just pointed out, because I think the first one, the fact that it's very nuanced is so true, because for a lot of people, for example, buying books for their kids brings them and their kids happiness. And it's so hard for them because maybe at that particular moment in time, they cannot afford it. And so I think saying money cannot buy happiness is a generalization. It doesn't apply to everyone. And that is true. So really, it depends on what we're talking about. And, for example, it will be sort of insensitive for people with money to say, oh yeah, money doesn't matter. It cannot buy happiness. I don't really need that much. Yeah, but what about the people that don't have money? what about those? Maybe you should give the money to them instead of saying that it doesn't matter. I think
This
that's
could
also
lead to your
another thing.
happiness, right? By being
Exactly.
pro-social and
Yeah.
giving to the broader good,
Exactly.
increasing that meaningfulness,
Yeah.
positive
Yeah.
cycle here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where kindness is part of this conversation too, right? Because we have been touching on the fact that, you kind of mentioned pro-social behavior, and kindness is a very big part of that. So let's talk about kindness. What is kindness exactly?
Yeah. So kindness. So when we think about kindness, so oftentimes we will look at acts and I do this, right? So my own research, I'm looking at a specific kind of kind act, which I'm often looking at pro-social input, which is information that we're giving to people in order to improve their well-being. But I'm saying that's a small component of kindness, and kindness I think would be broader in terms of not only altruistic acts, beyond just information, but expressions of empathy, having positive social interactions. But I think a key piece of it, and the core piece of it, is the underlying motivation. So if I am doing you a favor because I expect you to return the favor and do something to me, that may not be kindness, right? That's just exchange, right? Kindness is this positive motivation, the intention to promote the well-being of someone else. So we can have the same act, and in one case we can consider it kindness, and another we may not consider it kindness. And there's a whole debate about whether people can truly be altruistic or not. But I'm going to set that aside for now and just say that if we, in our heart of hearts, believe that we are intending to have a positive impact on others, and that would be kindness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also, this is another thing like happiness as well. Like it's sort of hard to define, also hard to measure, but you know it when you see it. And I think the intention piece is very important, because a lot of people just forget about the fact that when you do something nice and you say that that is kindness, but you actually have an underlying intention behind that, that's probably not actually kindness. And I think that's the nuance of kindness, very similar to happiness. So when it comes to these concepts, again, they're kind of like really hard to define. You know it when you see it, but we know that kindness is, I think, at its core, a good thing. Now, how does it actually affect happiness?
Yeah, so that I think there's absolutely a reciprocal relationship there, right? So being kind can help bring about the factors that we know contribute to happiness. And being happy can help us be kinder. Yeah. So for example, if we are going to give someone a compliment, it can influence our experience of positive emotion. It can increase our social connection. And that social connection can, again, come back and influence our happiness positively. So there's kind of a positive, virtuous cycle there that I think can play out both on a very micro scale. So if we're just in the moment, our emotions, as well as on a more broad macro scale, where you think about over time, developing these relationships and creating meaning in your life and others' lives.
Yeah, definitely. And also it sounds to me like, if there's that sort of reciprocal relationship between kindness and happiness, it might also mean that when there's a lack of kindness in your life, maybe this from yourself, from other people, your level of happiness sort of drops. And that might cause another drop in your level of kindness, because life's not so kind to you. So you're also not kind to yourself or to other people. And then it keeps repeating itself. It's like a vicious cycle.
I think absolutely that can manifest. So you're missing out on, first, that emotional piece, that immediate piece, but also these connections that you're all of a sudden not making over time. Maybe you're making a negative connection if you're experiencing an environment that's lacking in kindness. And that can certainly, I think, lead to a decrease in happiness over time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's actually quite challenging when we look at that relationship, because, now that you mentioned the reciprocal relationship between the two, I'm kind of thinking, okay, so if at the moment your level of happiness and kindness are kind of a little bit on the higher side, you're safe and you're kind of okay, and you can sort of keep working on that. But what if you're in that, vicious cycle of, low level of kindness, low level of happiness, and it just keeps manifesting and it doesn't stop? How can we get out of that?
So I think there's always something that we can do ourselves, right? So if we can break this cycle by ourselves determining that we are going to be kind. So I think that one really powerful manifestation of this is the expression of gratitude. So there's been a lot of burgeoning research on this and how expressing gratitude, people are reluctant, right? So a lot of people will be concerned that it will be awkward. So things like writing a former boss about their impact on you kind of out of the blue, right? So people will do this, and it actually, that can help kind of get you out of this negative cycle, because all of a sudden, when you send that letter, often you do hear back, right? And often, if you're sending something positive in the world, and what research has shown is that it's much less awkward than people think it's going to be, first of all, but that it's a much more positive experience than people anticipate that it's going to be as well. So that's really really valuable research by Kumar and Epley, and I think Zhao and Epley have a paper on that as well that is really looking at this particular intervention. But I think that's a really great way to leverage what we know about happiness and its contributors to loop in kindness and bring ourselves into that kind of more positive happiness spiral.
Yeah, definitely. I think gratitude is such a big piece of it, because I do recall, and I think everyone can relate to this, even if they have not read any research on this. Imagine, going through a really tough time in life, and all you can see would be all these different difficult problems arising. And then all you focus on would be, the endless problems in life. And you probably forget, and I find that in myself as well. Sometimes you just forget to notice that, oh, actually, you know what? I've got a lot of kindness in my life that I'm grateful for, whether it be from family, friends, strangers. I caught myself last year. It's kind of like I think it was like a winter day. It was really cold, and I was probably running late or something on the tram. And then someone was doing something out of kindness, and they were like really nice. But because I was having a bad time, I was just annoyed. And then later on, I reflected on that, and I was like, that's weird. Why did they piss me off even though they did something nice? And then I realized it was just, it was a lack of happiness, a lack of kindness from within my own self. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I should actually have been thankful and said thank you, instead of just stared at them.
And I think you're hitting on the really one very core way that people are prevented from getting into this cycle, and that is time and stress.
Yeah.
Right. So why are people not kind? Why are people not recognizing this? I think that we discount the effect that feeling a lack of time and feeling stress can have on this behavior. So one of my favorite academics in this space, Elad Scherf, has this paper, and it's looking at organizational justice, which is essentially whether organizations are treating their employees fairly and how they're communicating with them.
Yeah.
And when he the title of the paper is so memorable. It's "Too Busy to Be Fair," and it perfectly encapsulates this notion that because we're so busy, we often just overlook these things that we want to do, right? Like managers want to be fair, right? We want to be kind. We want to care about this stuff. But often we're so busy that all these other things get in the way of that. So I think taking a breath, giving ourselves those extra few minutes to get somewhere can make a difference in some of the, shorter term and maybe even higher level macro effects that we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. There's just so many layers of interactions here when we're talking about the workplace, and I think similar in life too. And like we were just discussing, I think there's quite a few things that can prevent people from, being kind in their daily interactions, like what I was giving you as an example. And then you were saying, like even managers, right? I think it's definitely important to have that empathy, from both ends, whether you're in a managerial position or not, or, like whether it be, the person on the tram that was kind to you and, you being the person that was not so good at receiving the kindness. I think it's just a very tough space to navigate sometimes. And I think another piece is we got to be kind to ourselves, because I think sometimes the fact that we are not kind to ourselves stop us from being kind in our daily interactions, because we're so busy in here, like fighting with whatever it is that's happening. And I find that to be the case with a lot of people, especially for myself. I've noticed that more often than not,
Yes, certainly. So I think that inner monologue can play a really big role. But doing, anything that we can do internally to take that type of stress out of the equation will stop us from being so distracted, and maybe open us up to being able to have these types of interactions and express kindness and perspective take and feel that empathy.
Yeah, definitely. Taking that moment is tough. And I really appreciate people that can do that, because I know that a lot of people actually go through tough times and they're, probably kinder than the ones that are having a great time. And I think oftentimes in our society nowadays, kindness is actually considered a weakness. And that's quite interesting, because I find it to be like this weird thing going on, especially, as I grew a little bit older. I started to notice that some people kind of like the people that are a little bit, more distant, look a little bit more cooler. And, that's kind of like, like you gotta be like hip, and you gotta be like, you don't care, and that's cool. But then if you show that, oh, you care and you're kind, you're smiling and you're helping, that's not very cool. That happens sometimes in, a few kinds of environments. And I find that to be a very interesting space to navigate, especially, sometimes I get to interact with younger people, whether that be your students or, people that are fresh out of college. They have this perception, this notion that, being kind is not that cool. It's a weakness. So what is your take on this interesting concept that's going on out there, and how can we debunk it, and how can we change it?
That's so interesting. So I had not really thought about kindness being a weakness. I think that I have always seen both sides of that, but I see the context that you're talking about, in which kindness may be considered more of a weakness. And I think that when we think about kindness and these kind of longer term effects that we're talking about, and its linkages with happiness. So what kindness can do is it can both, of course, improve our internal emotions, as well as enable us to make and foster and keep our social connections strong and healthy. Not only in the workplace, of course, which is where I'm always thinking, but of course outside of the workplace as well. But when we think about these interactions you're talking about, I'm hearing maybe a high school context or something.
Could be.
What I think is over time, kindness will lead people to have stronger, more robust, longer lasting, and more beneficial relationships. So I think that probably if we're seeing that kindness is seen as a weakness, probably the time horizon is not correct, right? Yeah. Under that analysis. And what I mean, there is some evidence for this, right? So one of my colleagues, Martha Jung, has a paper looking at single shot negotiations. So they're negotiating for an iPhone in one of her studies. And what they find is that when the negotiator is tough, right, not so kind seeming, they actually, get better counter offers and end up gaining from that, right? And these single shot interactions versus being warm. But at the same time, that's a one shot, right? So if we continue this over time and start thinking about our workplace relationships, thinking about our relationships with our managers, thinking about our relationships with our subordinates, right? These are the determinants of our ultimate success. So by and large, nowadays, often our actual work performance is literally in the eyes of our colleagues. So many organizations will have employees rate each other effectively, and that will determine how we perform, right? We're not necessarily, of course, this is not going to be true in a lot of contexts, right? So like a manufacturing context, any context in which you can specifically measure output, this is not going to be true, but in a lot of contexts, this is true. And I would argue even in context when you are measuring output, this will still matter.
Yeah.
Right. So there's I would say a counterpoint to this negotiations paper is another paper looking at workplace networks. And they are specifically looking at advice networks, but advice networks are the way we think about social networks in an organization. It's like, who are people going to when they want to get information, right? So it's very powerful to be at the center of an advice network. You want to be that person that everyone is looking to communicate, because then you'll be the hub of information and they'll be very well connected. So what this paper by Tiziana Cassiauer and her co-author Lobo, what they found was that people who what they were comparing were competent jerks. So really competent people who were not so nice with what they called lovable fools, right? So people who were very warm, maybe not seen as the most competent, right? And what they found is that those lovable fools were actually more central, right? So more people were going to the lovable fools, and they were, as a result, in this structurally more powerful social position, right? So over time, that's going to aggregate into benefits for your career. So that's where I think kindness is playing the long game.
Yeah, definitely. I think so too. And, if we're talking about the managerial context, I get an example that would probably be a little bit more relatable and close to what you're talking about from my own self, because I think I'm the kind of manager that is a bit more on the kinder side. And, I don't always measure outputs without considering other factors in whatever is going on in my team's lives. And I remember getting a comment from one of my managers a long time ago saying, so soft. It's kind of like very similar to what we've been discussing. Kindness in this context sounds like a weakness. I didn't think so. Obviously I got the feedback. It was like the 2-word sentence. It's not even a sentence. And that haunted me for days. And then I started thinking about it, and I was like, I think I'm just being kind to my team and, be really fair in considering the different factors that might affect them. It's not always about the number game, because we can measure outputs all we want. And in fact, I've got a team member that used to perform really well, probably like one of the stars of the team. And then one day that team member's performance just dropped dramatically. And instead of going, what's going on? Why is it so low? The question that I asked, and I think which was the right question to ask, was, can we investigate what's going on in this person's lives, or perhaps work? In the very environment, because they could be performing really well, and then one day they get burnt out and they don't do it as well, or they could be performing really well and something happens in their lives and then that affects their performance. It could be the case, and I think it's just not fair to say, you, as a manager, you got to be tough. And I do see tough managers. I've seen a few of them in my career so far, and while they are really sharp, they get things done. They're not enjoyable to work with.
Right. So over time, when you eventually are in a role where you are maybe having control over a decision that affects them, right? That's going to impact their eventual career as well. And I'm not, and I think that I do want to draw a line between kindness and emphasizing performance, right? Because I think, we often can think of these things as two ends of a scale, but I don't think that that's true at all. I think that what you have done is, right, what your appraisal of that situation enabled you to do was then have a conversation with your employee and figure out what are the critical factors that are driving this drop in performance. And that kindness opened up that opportunity, then now you have something that you can do potentially.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know the particular situation. I'm not asking you to necessarily share details, but I think that that's the step that we can take, where now by being kind, we have a better understanding of the drivers of our team's performance and can take steps to tangible steps that can change that. Right. So if it's some, challenge with family, well, maybe that means that we can change your work schedule to figure out something that works better for you. Just the kindness opens up the ability to have those discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important to be flexible in that sense. And kindness opens up, like you're saying, a bunch of other things that we can do. And, I think the first very critical aspect of it is being open-minded about whatever information you receive, because that itself shows kindness. Because otherwise you operate on sort of like an unwritten manual where, everything has to be a certain way. And I think it's kind of hard to navigate. So I don't blame managers when they find it hard to navigate this space, because, they know what they know. And for a lot of people, they're kind of like, oh, this is like a first time I'm, let's say, working with someone on the other side of the world, or, like from a very different background, or with this kind of personality, or, so much can happen. But I think a very important thing as well, since we're on the topic of kindness, is the fact that I think research has shown, and I don't know the exact number, but it has shown that, our society nowadays is a bit more on the individual side. So in the past, we used to be, really open. We had the sense of community, family, and we probably were more open to groups, and even with neighbors. So I think the research paper was talking about something along the line of, the trend is now people are kind of like more individual, a little bit more self-centered, if I might quote that particular word, and they like to keep to themselves. They don't really don't necessarily contact or get in touch with social groups like they used to. I personally noticed this to be true in my own lives, even, whether it be in, in Vietnam, where I was from, I was born, or here in Australia. It's kind of very similar, because I hear conversations about people talking about this all the time. So I wonder if there's actually any research paper you've read that sort of come across that concept. And also, if that is the case, what can we actually do to, increase this level of kindness when the trend kind of showing that we're facing a situation where everyone is living in this world where it's a bit more self-centered.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So you're talking about, I'm hearing you talk about a lot of connectedness, and being part of a community and seeing yourself as identified as part of the community. And I haven't delved deeply into that particular research that you're discussing, but it wouldn't surprise me, given this structure of things like employment relationships that have evolved over the past few decades, right? Whereas once we were working for one organization, maybe for most of our careers, that has significantly changed. We've had lots of financial, or I don't know, maybe not lots, but several financial downturns that have really interrupted people's sense that they are part of this whole. And so just one time, witnessing that, or witnessing a close relative or friend go through something like that, can really shift our perception that we are really deeply connected with our organization. But I think that, so, and that's related, but separate from necessarily kindness. So that it's this feeling of connectedness. Certainly kindness could foster that, but I think that even in the absence of kindness, that's something that's going on maybe separately. So there's the relationship there, but I'm not sure that I would propose a kindness-centric intervention to address that. But what I would propose is, we know that having community, having strong relationships is a key variable in a lot of positive outcomes, right? So we want to, and I was talking about kind of advice networks. There's also all of the research on longevity, right? And the importance that relationships play in our longevity, as well as happiness and well-being. So I would encourage people to make those connections and to reach out when they, move to a new community. There's a proactivity that is going to have to happen, right? So I would encourage people to be proactive and try to make those connections. And given that people are moving around organizations a lot more than previously, maybe it's joining something like a professional organization where you will always be part of that profession, or for a long time at least, versus maybe you'll go between organizations, but you'll always have that kind of grounded connection to a broader organization where you are in a community and regularly encountering the same individuals. So I think there's a piece of it that people can navigate in that way. But in terms of, practicing kindness, I think that we can also look at it through that lens, right? So on a more micro level now, when we go pick up our coffee, right, we can put down our phone for a second and greet the barista, for example, right? So small things can help, especially if we're in a new community. These small things might be able to bring back that humanness and that sense of human connection.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's where we encounter a sense of scarcity when it comes to kindness from time to time. And we can easily pick that up and, do little things like you recommend, because I think it's not that hard. Sometimes I myself, I'm kind of like that, because I remember, I don't remember what it was, but I think it was just like I went to a particular, let's just say a shop to do something, and it just went straight to business, like, hi. And then, straight, ended up talking about something. And then the other person, I don't remember what it was. They were just probably like a counter person or probably a barista. I don't remember the exact context. They were kind of like, hi, how are you? And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Straight to business. It's my bad. I'm good. How are you? And then actually, have that midday moment of actually being reminded to be kind. And I think that's what it's saying. It's important when you are practicing it yourself, and then you kind of spreading that. And sometimes you forget, and then when other people remind you, it's just a matter of absorbing the information and adjusting yourself accordingly. Because I think we're all guilty of this, when we're busy and tired and whatnot. So let's talk about a practice or a habit that we can all do to manage the scarcity of kindness around us, because I think it happens, and I don't know about other places, but I think in a city like Melbourne, it's interesting because sometimes you're always in a rush and you forget about it, and then other times you actually pay attention to how kind people are around you, even if it's like really busy. But I wonder how you would approach it yourself. So let's say Hayley is dealing with a tough time, lots of things to do, very busy juggling family and work. And you notice that there's a scarcity of kindness around you, and from all sources, from work, from family, from your community. And then now you kind of have to manage yourself to counteract it and to kind of boost your level of kindness, whether it be for yourself or for other people. What would be a little thing that you would practice to make that happen?
Yeah, so I think of one thing, if we're talking about just our daily interactions, I do really think, and this plays back into your story about trying to catch the bus, right? It was bus? Am I have that right? Or,
probably a tram.
Tram. I think leaving yourself extra time. I think I do this. I set my alarm for when I had to leave, and I intentionally set it before. I try to give myself 5 extra minutes.
Yeah.
Certainly that could vary a lot depending on the actual distance at which you need to travel and the variability of that. But I try to give myself those extra minutes so that I don't feel so pressed to be on my phone answering emails, for example, while I'm waiting for something, and can broaden my focus and feel that I can engage with someone that I'm interacting with and fully, and not, trying to multitask so much, which I think is something that we naturally are falling victim to because of this feeling of time stress. So that's kind of one, just trying to give yourself extra time. And I think of it as a gift to myself that now I'm not going to be running and trying to, be on the phone while I'm running. Instead, we can take in a little bit of nature, maybe if I'm walking outside to get somewhere, or have that extra time to greet others and be that positive interaction in their day. Because like you said, you might be the only positive interaction that people are exposed to that day. So that's one. And the second one is, this is more responding to inbound things. So often you'll be in a situation where someone is not going to get something done in time, or is delivering something that is subpar compared to what you had hoped it would be. So these kind of negative inbounds, let's say. And there, I think I try to imagine my worst day and think about what is it like to feel the way you feel on your worst day, and then imagine that others may be experiencing that. And this goes back to your anecdote as well. This, well, there must be something going on with my colleague's life if they were a top performer and are now dropping the ball a little bit.
Yeah.
So imagine their worst day and treat accordingly within parameters, right? I'm not saying, okay, now I'm just going to do their work. I'm going to do, the task for people or anything like that. But try to approach things in a way that you would want others to approach for you on your worst day.
Yeah, definitely. I really love that. I think that's actually really tough for a lot of people to practice, if I might add, because I think that's another piece of empathy that we need to add to the picture of kindness. Some people just find it hard to empathize, and they care, and kind of like similar to the point that we were mentioning before, where I mentioned that, it's a bit more self-centered nowadays. It's not just the sense of connectedness, but now that I realize, I think more about it, throughout our conversation, I realize it's actually more like, people care more about themselves than others, and, their needs go first. It's gotta be first. And then after that, whatever energy they have left, then, that they might think about others, or maybe not. And it's quite challenging, because I'm thinking about a few individuals in my head right now where I can actually, notice that in them. And I think approaching it from the lens of empathy, like you're saying, would really help to boost kindness. At the same time, certain people will probably need more reminders. And I think these can be reminders to themselves. How it's actually, I mentioned this at the beginning. I'll throw it right back. I said it might be a cheesy conversation. It might actually be, because how people have notes like, be kind to yourself. And you see that everywhere. It could be on the street, on Instagram, and, in a video somewhere, like a music video or whatever you might see. It sounds really cheesy, but I think it works, because people just need a reminder sometimes. Like, they probably forget. Why do I need to be kind to myself? Of course I'm kind to myself. And then actually they're not. And then because of that, they're not kind to other people, because they don't really have that empathy. Let's say you have a really tough day and you're being so hard on yourself, you're probably going to do the same thing for other people. So, I kind of make the connections there, because I think empathy and kindness, they kind of go hand in hand. If you don't really have that certain level of empathy, it will be really hard to actually show kindness.
So I think to those who are having a hard time with the empathy piece, or with wanting to even be kind, I can offer this positive spiral, right? So I can say, well, often if you are kind, likely it'll lead to some positive emotion, maybe more positive than even you think, right? And exactly. some research in different domains suggests that these experiences are often more positive than we think they're going to be. So there's that piece. And then think about, over time, this can increase your social connection, ultimately, which we know can increase happiness. So don't do it for empathy. Do it for yourself.
Yeah, that is true. Might defeat the purpose a little bit, but I think that's a really good point. Good reminder.
Well, you're right. It defeats the purpose for an individual. But if you're talking about that societal lack of kindness, well, then maybe I'm less worried about your motivation, as we said.
Yeah, because you're talking about intention, right? So that might defeat the purpose of intention a little bit. But I agree with you. When that sort of go around, then you notice it, and then maybe your intention will change. So initially you might do it for yourself, and then later on you do it simply because, but that's why I said this topic is so hard to talk about, because it's kind of like there's research, and there's also the vague little things that you notice from people. Anyway, that's really good advice. Thank you, Hayley. And next up, we have open mic. I know that you wanted to talk about a particular topic that you had in mind earlier. I'm not sure if we actually covered it at all, but if not, let's talk about it.
Yeah, so it relates to kindness, right? So I touched on this a little bit, that most of my research is studying a specific category of kindness, which I am kind of putting under the umbrella of pro-social input.
Yeah.
So information that we give to another person that will benefit them. So classically, we think about this being something like advice, something like feedback, right? So these are effectively topics that the thing that you're giving, the kindness that you're giving, is the information. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a really interesting domain because on top of things like busyness and stress stopping us from being kind, these types of interactions have an extra barrier, which is people's concerns about giving this type of information. So we know, for example, that people might feel awkward when they're giving advice, right? They feel, well, who am I? Who am I to give advice? Or when giving feedback, they may be concerned about the repercussions for their relationship with that person that they're giving feedback to. And I think that what several studies have shown is that people actually really value this information, right? More than it overcomes our awkwardness in providing it. It overcomes, maybe these potential relational challenges. I'll say, as a researcher, in aggregate, there probably are specific situations in which that's not the case, right? If you're gonna, there are extremes, of course, to which this will not apply. But by and large, when we do provide people with this pro-social input, it's much less negative for us than we think it's going to be, and it's much more positive for the recipient and for us than we think it's going to be. So in my research, one element that I look at is actually how can we improve the content of this information? So specifically with respect to developmental input, which is traditionally discussed as feedback, and I'll tell you why I'm calling it developmental input in a second, a really key element of that kind of makes or breaks whether people can respond to it is its specificity. And this goes back to your feedback story, because you received like a 2-word feedback message and it sounded like you're like, okay, what do I do with this? Right? It just made you feel bad. There's no way, you don't know what actions you can take to improve from that. It's not clear, right? Mm-hmm. So one thing I'm doing in my research, I have several papers looking at how can we improve the specificity, the concreteness of these comments, because when comments are concrete, not only are you going to know what it is that you can do to improve, right? You've got a concrete action, but also some research shows that when we're more specific, we are seen as more credible, right? So if I give you feedback that's like very specific about something you did, well, I was paying attention, I'm invested, versus if it's 2 words, well, who knows how much you really cared about that or put into that. So looking at improving developmental input specificity. So one really quick intervention that we've found that can consistently, we have many studies in which we're showing this, increase the specificity of these comments is by asking for advice instead of feedback. So when we look across organizations, largely they are soliciting what they're referring to as feedback. And what that's doing is making people look at the past, making them look at in aggregate in an evaluative way, and in some cases, maybe inhibiting them from thinking about what can be done in the future. And this future focus of advice really enables people to provide those concrete, specific actions that people can take to improve. So that would be one very quick, very low touch way that we can improve the developmental information that people are given. And that's why I don't call it, or that's why I don't like to call it feedback, because rather than being feedback, we're thinking about developmental input and how can we improve that?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think it's such an important point for everyone to know, because we probably give unsolicited feedback from time to time, and, developmental input would be so much more helpful. That just
Or
reminds me of
advice, even.
advice. Yeah. Yesterday, I went through something very similar and I'm still processing it. I was talking to my colleague about it today. I was like, I don't know why that person gave me that comment. It does not help me whatsoever, because there was no action point to take. So anyway, that was very in line with what you were saying. And I think we can definitely be a bit more mindful in giving, instead of feedback, let's focus on the developmental inputs. If we were to talk to anyone, that would be very helpful. So it's been really wonderful hearing from you today, because, there's so much research that you sort of pointed out. And I was kind of like, okay, I'll try to remember those names, but I think I'll have to go back to the podcast later, because, a lot of research papers there. So before we let you go, obviously, there's so much work that you've been doing, and I'm sure our audience would like to find out more about it. If they do, where should they go?
Yes, so I have a website. It is HayleyBlunden.com. So my first name, last name.com.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for being here today, Hayley. It was really great to talk to you, even though it's late at night where you are. And I hope the audience learned from you as much as I did.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed our conversation as well.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.